eating together. Share, eat, learn, act. Sharing stories about food and society, explaining and inspiring actions to support and improve food systems.
Hi, I'm Tasha, and today we are hearing Psyche Williams-Forson interviewed by Peter Shea on the television series The Bat of Minerva. Psyche is a professor of American Studies, Women's Studies, and African American Studies, and a member of the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland. For more information about this event and others in this series, see foodfieldguides.com.
I'm often asked, how did you start studying food? What was your interest? And aside from perhaps just the everyday wanting to consume food, right? I really have been studying food since I was a child, I guess, because my family was very much involved in FHA and Future Homemakers of America. My sister had her own. She used to enter the tomato contest, and my family had a garden. And so I've always had this sort of tangible relationship to food, but the actual idea to study it did not in fact come until graduate school. My interest was really in material culture and the study of materials and artifacts in our lives. And I got interested in this I'm an avid reader, and particularly of African American women's literature. So when I went back to graduate school, and even before that, that's what I was studying. And so I came across this novel that had a very interesting scene in it where an African American woman was trying to compete for the top prize of a piano. And in order to do that, she ordered a possum sent to her from Virginia. And then she proceeded to cook this possum in a way that was to an audience that was very exclusive. And she goes on not to win the prize ultimately, in part because of this sort of trickery. And so just the presence of that whole scene in a 19th century novel really raised my interest and piqued my curiosity around why this author would put this particular food scene in the book. And then much later, I, as it turns out, was researching for a professor. And she was studying Jewish, Irish, and Italian foodways. And I said, well, I wonder if African American people have this thing called foodways. I had never heard of it. This was in the early 90s, right, or the mid 90s, I think. And so when I started looking at African American people in foodways, I primarily came across cookbooks, which are absolutely fabulous resources. But it didn't tell me why certain foods were being attributed to African Americans. It simply told me what they were eating. As a result, I began to then say, this is the thing I want to study. This is the material area of people's lives I'm really interested in, and that is the study of food. I'm very interested in the why people consume and people's behaviors around food are what they are. And the only way that you can get at that kind of information is to talk to people. Doing the sort of historical research is important, but really you become more of a participant observer. You begin to think back over your own life and the various encounters you've had with food. You begin to draw on just myriad sources, popular culture, literature, music, and you begin to see all of these different references to food. And so that really becomes the basis for this kind of work that I've done. It's been real world life experiences. And so part of my being at this conference this weekend has been to talk a little bit about some new directions that I see food taking, not only globally, but locally and in our own community. And that is really more the involvement of spaces that we tend not to consider when we're thinking about alternative food networks. When we use that phrase, we mostly think about community-supported agriculture and farmers markets and things of that nature. And what I was suggesting is that we need to expand that definition of alternative to be much more inclusive of so many other places and spaces.
Can you tell me a little bit about the kind of research you do when you're trying to get at the why behind the item in the cookbook, the possum, for example?
Right. Well, you asked the question of people, and there are two prongs to that, because historically so much of this information is going to be lost because the people who could tell you have gone on, they're deceased. But taking the folks that you have now, and particularly in African American culture, which is so very much an oral culture, it's extremely important that we gather these oral histories. You talk to as many people in as many generations as possible. What exactly is the reason that anyone would want to eat a possum? How do you cook possum? And why would it be favored in the New England area as a delicacy from the South? Those are the kinds of questions that you begin to ask. Some of them you can draw from historical sources, some you can draw from literature, but by and large, I tend to conduct interviews with a vast array of people in all walks of life. Sometimes it's by survey. I send out a survey. Nowadays you can do that pretty easily, but also it may be going in to talk to church populations or conducting a focus group with another group of people I happen to simply come across. So there are systematized methods for this. It's not willy-nilly. I have to get permission and so forth. But I'm just suggesting that there are very few spaces that should be closed off to us as sources of information.
Can you tell me a bit about what you've learned? What kind of things come out in these interviews?
Well, one of the things that comes out that I think we often do not consider when we're talking about food are the subtle power differences. And I'm very, very interested in how power operates in and through the muted nature of objects. An object in and of itself doesn't speak for the most part, but there are ways that you can take particular objects, in my case food, and you can read sort of power dynamics that take place in them. Just recently, I was sharing with some people at this conference about a blog I wrote about a month ago at the request of an organization, and I was explaining about an experience I had multiple decades ago where I had been invited to someone's house for dinner, and when I got there, the only thing that they served was vegetarian food. That in and of itself was not the problem. The issue was this was the late 80s. Very few people were eating vegetarian or were acknowledging that they were vegetarian, so we were a much more carnivorous environment. And the food that was served was not palatable, but it was also, more importantly, it was served by someone who was in a position of power over me and other people who went to this affair. And so it became very interesting because what we asked when we were invited, what should we bring? We were told don't bring anything. Then when you get to this event, there's like almost nothing you can eat. It's the same situation if we invited today, if you were to invite a vegetarian to your home and all you served was turkey or hamburgers, it's the same kind of thing. And in that, you find power. Food can speak volumes about who's in charge, how they respect your wishes, things of that nature. And so that's been one of the most revealing aspects to me, the ways in which power reveals itself in food. The other big piece is the way in which class, right, reveals itself as well. Just the simple fact of, again, you invite someone to your house and you serve something like prickly pear or cassava leaf or something, and folks are like, well, I don't know what this is. I don't know how to eat it, or, avocado, if you will. And those kinds of things can serve to alienate people, but they can also suggest different class status and markers.
Yeah. Well, I remember, the meals of my youth were my mother's women's club luncheons.
Yes.
And of course, those were ritualized.
Yes.
They were absolutely what you serve, but then people would push the boundaries just a little bit. But you had to be careful. I mean, you couldn't push them too far or you'd produce something strange and make people uncomfortable.
Yes.
But I think with my mother, and I have to check this out, that she was very much under the spell of the women's magazines.
Sure.
Those things were giving the marching orders about what the women's club lunch was supposed to do. Is that the same thing happening in the African American community?
It does. It did then and it does now. And if I can speak for a moment, just contemporarily, I mean, Oprah, the old magazine, becomes the prescription for what to say, to do, to wear. And if not Oprah, then you have, of course, Martha Stewart's magazine, right, which a lot of people swear by for events and for bridal showers and things of this nature. That becomes the sort of place to go. Historically, there were actual etiquette books and manuals that told African Americans, particularly those who were migrating from the north to from the south to the north and to the west, what to do, to say, and to wear. And it was a huge reformer movement that said, if you're coming from the south to the north, you don't speak like this, you don't eat these kinds of foods. So it's the same kind of prescriptive behavior, like you said at the women's club. If tea sandwiches were just fine, but if you dared to put, maybe a tea sandwich with some spread that was foreign to people, now you've pushed that boundary a bit too far. There's a great film that was written and produced by Spike Lee, and it involved Whoopi Goldberg and her counterpart. I forget his name right now, but in the movie, she is getting ready to host such a women's club, and this is in the 70s, and she and her husband are African American in a predominantly white area, and so she was like, what am I supposed to serve? I don't know what. And so all the her friends tell her, oh, they love mayonnaise sandwiches, and so she goes to the store and she buys all this Wonder Bread and puts just gugabs of mayonnaise on it and a little bit of lettuce, and she serves it, and the sandwiches are of course eaten up, and so that's sort of like falling within this particular dictum that says these tea sandwiches are what are appropriate for your guest at this time and in this place.
Yeah. I'm remembering another meal. My aunts they had money, not a lot, but enough money that they could kind of entertain as they wished.
Sure.
And when we came to visit, 3 unmarried aunts put their full energy into doing a meal, and it was superb.
Yes.
And every little piece of it was superb, and it was designed to delight the nieces and nephews and so forth. But I remember then when they declined, and the meal they served then, and you could just absolutely taste the fact that they weren't there anymore.
Yes.
They just lost the ability to put this thing together.
Right.
And so I thought about, the food was really, their being able to do this was the measure of them still being competent.
Sure, absolutely. There's some great stories about that. I just recently, in fact, my grandparents are from, or lived in Minneapolis for the last maybe 2 decades of their lives. They both just passed away within 6 months of one another this past year. And I was thinking back to just some of the fabulous things that my grandmother used to make, rum balls and these magnificent rolls that were so mouth-watering that we would actually say, can you send them to us in the mail? And she did. And at the point at which those things ceased was right around the time when she began to enter her own mental decline, as you said. And so in that way, food becomes a real marker of memory, and so it marks a period of happiness, but also certainly a period of sadness, because that transition starts to take place and it gets marked on the food. It gets marked on the food. Another thing that's really interesting about that, I had a colleague who has written about her great aunt who hosted a similar kind of women's affair, and all of the women who attended used to be former domestics. And so when she went with her aunt to one of these affairs, it was very well, the table was very ornately laid out. There was a tea set, there were all kinds of implements. And her aunt ended up apologizing to the rest of her friends because her great niece did not know how to use the implements because she had never done day's work. She had never worked as a domestic in anyone's house, so she didn't know all the different implements, whereas they did because, of course, they were used to setting the table for the people whom they worked for. That's just a fabulous story to me that, and the scholar Elizabeth Clark Lewis writes about it just sort of as a poignant example of the importance of what people learned when they did domestic work in African American history.
There's a food scene I remember from a movie. I wonder if your research has gone in this direction. It's from one of my favorites, kind of sleeper, called January Man, which is about a highly intelligent and rather strange guy, and who's always testing the women he's interested in by feeding them weird things. And if they're willing to try it, he knows they might have a future. Yes, if they just won't touch the octopus, no way. But there must be, in fact, one of the places where the risks get taken is on the first date.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially in restaurants, but then that first time you cook for the guy.
Oh, sure.
Is there stuff there that's fun?
Yeah, there is. In fact, there's a short story that this is exactly what I mean by there are times in your life you've read things and you had no idea of its relevance. And then many, many years later, when you do want to refer to that piece of material, what have you can't find it. There are two such pieces of work in my life that I will probably take to my grave trying to find. That's the long way of getting to answer your question. But there's this fabulous short story about a woman who goes, she's American, African American, she goes to, I think, one of the Caribbean islands with her fiance. And while she's there, she meets the fiance's family and, she's getting acquainted. And at one point she goes to the sink and there's this muskrat in the sink and it's been recently killed. And she, of course, freaks out because, she's not used to seeing a rat, this giant rat in the sink. And so then later on, what happens is the mother prepares this as part of the meal. And come to find out, this is part of the national dish of this particular culture. And so they're sitting at the table, and this will go back to my point about power, and she basically does not want to eat this food because, of course, she's seen it now, and it's pre-prepared stage, and now it's after stage. And she's very reluctant. And so her fiance says, I can't believe that you're going to reject my mother and her traditions by not trying this food. So this woman sits here in this dilemma, and then finally she forces herself to eat a forkful, and her eyes start filling with tears, right? Because she doesn't want to swallow it. The mother kindly reaches over with a napkin and says, spit it out. And she does. And the mother says to her something to the effect, you need to start out the way you're going to hold out. Don't let him, browbeat you into trying things that you don't want to try. So there's power, again, as I was mentioning earlier, working on all kinds of levels there. It's not so much that she wasn't daring, but should he have asked her to try this food, he made it seem as if she didn't, then she would shame his mother. The mother, on the other hand, is saying, you're a silly girl. Why would you take such, risk and do something you don't want to do? So in that situation, what is the win-win? There's another scene, and I don't know January Man, actually. I'm going to have to look it up. But, there's the familiar scene in Annie Hall where I forget the primary character, but they go to a deli, and I think she orders corned beef with mayonnaise, and immediately immediately Woody Allen knows that she's not familiar with the proper way to eat a corned beef sandwich, because no one asks for mayonnaise. It's got to be mustard and pickle and so forth. So there are all these kinds of subtle markers that will tell you a lot about a person, both the person who's making the request and the person who's trying to live up to the expectations.
Now, one thing I know happens, I wonder if you've run into this in your work, is the relationship to the food you had to eat
Yes.
before you had very much money.
Right.
And you had to eat it a lot.
Yes.
And
yes.
sometimes you kind of like it.
Yes.
And sometimes you're being in another class means you'll never touch that food again.
Right, absolutely.
And sometimes it's a kind of mixed thing.
Sure.
And then the question of whether you ever feed your kids
Yes.
the stuff you had to eat
Right.
growing up.
Right.
Or you had to eat in the Depression, or you had to eat. I'm wondering how that kind of figures in.
It does, I think. I've seen it in my own experience, but more recently, a couple of years ago, I had some friends over for dinner, for Easter dinner, and I served Brussels sprouts, and I served them with, a nice reduction sauce that had a nice balance to the bitterness of Brussels sprouts. But there was a guy who came to our dinner, and he absolutely refused to try them. He said it was something I was forced to eat as a child, and I said I would never ever eat another Brussels sprout. We couldn't try it. He's like, they look great. He's like, they have bacon, turkey bacon. He was like, all the things I might want, but it's just, I can't get past the memory of being forced to eat that food, right? And along those same lines, I know the big thing right now is eat oatmeal. It's good for your health. My father absolutely refuses to eat oatmeal. He's like, I grew up on it. It was always lumpy. It was nasty. It was slimy. I didn't like it then. I will never eat oatmeal. No matter that you may say, well, they now have it in individual packets. You put water in it, it'll be just fine. There's some things you can't get past. And so there's a real work of memory in there. As you mentioned, being familiar or being connected to hard times, or being connected to not liking the food, or whatever the case may be. But memory plays a powerful role in our connection to food.
Yeah. It's another phenomenon. I'm curious whether it has an African American. It's kind of proverbial in the Jewish context. Okay. And I'm wondering if it has an African American counterpart. And that is, in the Jewish context, there's always Jews go out to eat Chinese food, and it's a joke,
Right.
And kosher laws stop at the door of the Chinese restaurant.
Right.
And for some reason, my family that was Irish ended up having a Jewish deli as the place they went out. And it was sort of the limit of how odd the food would be that we would eat. So there's a sort of defined exotic, is what I mean.
Sure.
And I'm wondering, does that happen in African American? Are there directions for how the exotic gets defined?
It's defined, right? Well, historically, what's surprising is that there were a number of Chinese soul foods. You find this a lot in D.C., where you have Chinese, particularly Chinese, and African American communities really sort of side by side. So people probably would be surprised at how long, historically, African American people have been eating Chinese food. I found some similar advertisements for restaurants in Chicago during the 40s and 50s. And so perhaps that's as close as we have come to exotic in some ways, And when you say African American, you have to be very careful because you could also say black, which would encompass African immigrants, West Indian immigrants, and so forth and so on. And so for some African Americans, eating the exotic may be to go Caribbean. You see what I mean? To go out to a Caribbean restaurant, because Caribbean food is distinctly different, if you will, from, say, African American Southern food. You're going to find more peppers and different kinds of starches, and maybe escovitch fish that has a more vinegary taste, or another type of rundown sort of sauce. That's very different than African American, say, either fried or baked chicken and candied yams and so forth and so on. So how we cross the exotic as African American people could be as close as I'm eating other black foods, because that black now becomes other cultures, African, West Indian, Cape Verdean, whatever the case may be.
You mentioned soul food, which is a notion I've kind of heard all my life, but I've never had much connection. Can you say a little bit about that notion?
Sure. I speak a lot on this in the during the period of Black History Month, of course. So it's right at the tip of my mind because I just finished talking to some groups about this. But in the 60s, African American writer Leroy Jones, who changed his name to Amiri Baraka, responded to I believe it was a post that was in the New Yorker, where essentially a critic said the African American people, or Negro people at that time, had no definable cuisine. They had no culinary culture. He in fact countered by saying it's just the opposite, actually. The foods that many of the white bourgeois, and particularly in New York, are defining as delicacies are and have been historically the foods that African American people have always eaten. Chitlins, fried chicken, butter beans and corn, sweet tea, all kinds of pies and cakes. And so there's a whole culinary lexicon that he ascribes to African American people, and he defines it as soul food. This is the era of the 60s where Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, from James Brown and others, where Black people are really claiming a broader cultural identity as a way of identifying themselves as part of the larger American citizenry, right? And it becomes interesting that he then does this in part through the food. And he said these are foods that African American people have been eating during and since enslavement and continue to eat. And so even today, for the most part, when you say to people, I'm having Sunday dinner, the assumption is that there are going to be some particular foods that we know we can find at that table. Macaroni and cheese, collard greens, chicken, cornbread. I once had my secretary say to me, well, macaroni and cheese is not a Black food, is what she said. And she's right, it's not. It's a casserole, right? And so it actually would probably be more connected to the Midwest, right? From the standpoint of casseroles being a very fond dish in this region. But in fact, it's eating macaroni and cheese with those other foods as a part of the combination that makes it then definable as part of the soul food lexicon.
Right. I think the first thing I ever read about food is a piece by Mary Douglas, who's sort of like defining a meal.
Yes.
She was just fooling around as an anthropologist to see what she could leave out of her meal, right. And what her family thought was enough to make a meal.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how that works with the folks you've studied. I mean, Is there a sort of thing such that if it doesn't have this, or it doesn't have these stages, or it isn't this much, it isn't real, it doesn't count, we haven't been fed yet.
No, that's a great, Mary Douglas is deciphering a meal, is right. and when she goes and she says, let's have this for, supper, and her family says, well, I don't want just cold soup. That doesn't really make it a meal, right? And so they go through this whole thing, and as you said, by the time they're finished, she has made, in fact, a full supper. I think that's perhaps historically it was more the case, but now that you have fractured families and fractured eating times in families, and I think this is across the board, there may in fact not be the sort of combinations that we used to have, except for perhaps on Sunday. I'll tell you what's not acceptable in most African American communities, and I dare say in many communities on Sunday, a sandwich as dinner, that just would not be acceptable, or a bowl of soup unless someone is sick. And I think that's just across the board. Another experience that's very close to home, my husband is from Ghana, West Africa, and for him, a complete meal involves a starch. And I remember, and I've written about this publicly in some articles that I've written. I recall very early in our relationship when he came home for dinner, and I had made whatever I made, and he said, "Okay, what's my starch?" And that really threw me because as a Southerner and as one who's always tried to be attentive to weight and pounds and carbs and so forth, starch would not fall into my particular meal. But for him, the completion of the meal involves and ends with some kind of starch. So that would be the sort of example of the missing component in Mary Douglas's meal.
Is it part of the culture you fussed with that, at least on festive meals, there's got to be too much?
Yes, I think you could. That's a great question, but I'm not certain if it's done well. I would argue perhaps that in some instances it is done deliberately. It's like it's part of the festivity of the thing, of the event, to have an overabundance, right? It's just like for us in many African American communities, between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Or let me bring it more locally to my own family, it's always, okay, what are we going to have for Thanksgiving? So we know turkey, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, candy yams, stuffing and so forth and so on, which that's a whole other sort of distinction. A lot of communities say dressing. A lot of communities of African American people say stuffing. And then you come around to Christmas and you say, well, what are we going to have for Christmas dinner? Well, I don't know. It wouldn't be Christmas if we didn't have the exact same thing again. So now we have the turkey and maybe a ham, but pretty much the same sorts of things. And so you end up duplicating this abundance within the span of maybe a month, right? And so you have these two really heavily big meals. And then for some people, it's also repeated at every Sunday dinner. So it's the thing that makes it like, wow, this is a lot of food, but the absence of that can sometimes also suggest that there's not that warmth that people are looking for with relationship to food.
Yeah. I think the most powerful experience I ever had with food was, my parents had a farm.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
okay.
We had a lot of food.
Mm-hmm.
And it was always very good, and, you just ate till you didn't want to eat anymore. But then going to visit my mother's sister, family of 10, and a very strange circumstance, the idea that people came with their plate and people put a certain amount of food on the plate and then you went back and ate it.
Yes.
It just was scandalous.
Yes, you said scandalous.
I mean, it was like,
great. No, you're right.
Like totally wrong.
Yes.
I've never, just like, no, that's not how you eat.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, sometimes you can determine people who have relationships to scarcity, or who come from really large families where they have to compete for food. And sometimes this becomes evident if you're having a social gathering. The people who are always the first ones to the table, always without fail. And they get as much food as they can, or people who eat sort of in a hoarding kind of fashion, literally with their hand in front of their plate. There perhaps could be some suggestion there of hunger, and it becomes very telling. Or again, sometimes when the meal is served and someone comes from the other room, they're like, you better hurry up because, as if there won't be enough food. And so again, sometimes you could be spot on, sometimes you can be misreading the situation. But it's been my experience in my research that some people who react that way often come from situations of scarcity.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening today. Eating Together is produced by the Food and Society Workshop. You're listening to Eating Together. Share, eat, learn, act. Find today's episode and related stories at foodfieldguides.com.